Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to do this talk and to be with you all here. I really wish that we could be here with you guys more often. But right around this time, we are really in the middle of a heated salsa event. So it's serious. It's very serious. But thank you very much to Anne for inviting me to speak, and to Democrats abroad, Stuttgart in general, for having me, and for everybody here that's here tonight in specific for coming. So thank you. When Anne asked me to speak, I knew pretty much right away what I wanted to talk about. And the podcast that I host is Majority Villain. And the title is a reflection about the danger of democracy. People, when organized, always pose the greatest threat to an established elite who, for centuries, have tried to maintain a status quo by making us believe that our opinion matters. If it sounds like I feel cynical about it, it's because I am a little bit. And I think a lot of people have that feeling, at least occasionally. Most of the time, that opinion doesn't matter, unfortunately. It's only when we realize our mass as a group that we become quite dangerous, and in that, we become villains. I truly believe that having a democratic democracy is the key issue of our time. We can call it a democracy, and there is a belief that it is a linear path towards democracy, that somehow, once you have one, the hard work is done, and I just don't believe that's so. And if we've seen anything from the last 5-6 years on an international level, we've definitely become accustomed to what happens when we get a little too complacent with our democracies. All other issues, I believe, flow from this principle or lack of access to it. And history places democracy time and time again on the side of that which is good, as far back as we can recognize it as democracy. Today, we are acquiescing that power, our power, by continuing to operate in a simplified mindset of red team versus blue team. Because this mindset assumes that we are in fact on the team. And as George Carlin, the late great comedian, would say, it's a big club and you ain't in it. If that feels, again, pessimistic, I'm so sorry. Well, let's roll with the punches with me tonight, all right? We're going to see how that goes. But in a world that seems to push us with every passing chance, there is no great hope for us but realism. That seems to be the message over and over. Might is right. He with all the toys makes the rules. Pessimism is king. And raw force coupled with delicate but targeted manipulation is just pure capital. I hope to upend that theory a little bit tonight and proclaim with great confidence that there is real strength in weakness. And there's light in the dark, and in great fortune actually rests miserable poverty. And sincere honesty, when paired with humility, still provides us with an authenticity and a foundation for a discussion that can never be artificially manufactured. In this spirit, I'm going to begin by doing one thing that every speaker knows to be the absolute biggest mistake that he or she can do, and that is to alienate my audience within the first 3 minutes of this discussion. I did not vote for Hillary Clinton, and I feel like being invited to come here, it is my duty to be honest with you about that. And some of you may be angry with me. Some of you may wish that I would just walk out right now. But it may help to know that I certainly did not vote for Donald Trump. So I hope that's some sort of consolation. But I was raised on a Democratic diet. I fervently supported Barack Obama in 2008, reluctantly in 2012, and by the end of 2016, I was simply disappointed.
Did you vote?
I did. I did vote.
I don't care who, I just voted.
That's, well, and I think if there's one thing that everybody gets from this, participation is key to a functioning democracy, no matter where that lies. Now, you may not agree with all my points here tonight, but I do promise you one thing, and that is these views I'm expressing are certainly not uncommon. And I think as Democrats abroad, it's really important that you stay as perceptive to that and as receptive to that issue as you possibly can. They represent a real train of thought of millions of disenfranchised voters, both Democrat and Republican, and are a reflection of the growing number of people disillusioned by politics and the process in general, and the empty promises of our politicians. We are the majority. I simply saw no real choice in the election. in spite of the overwhelming evidence that one of the candidates clearly had absolutely no qualifications for the job. The main reason for my stance can be summarized by the problem of neoliberalism. That, in short, is to say that everything has a price tag. Economics is king. Deregulation is the best sort of regulation. Success is measured in dollars. Privatization over public use. Austerity over society. Some call it the free market. I call it Wall Street or War Street, but never, ever Main Street. Some of these terms are synonymous with Republican ideology. I think I would imagine we have some sort of consensus about that. But most are shared principles of the status quo, and that is the system in which we all participate. My goal tonight is not to do damage to the Democratic Party. That is not what I'm here for. The leadership of the party is already doing enough of that on their own. Not you, Ann. You're doing a great job. It is not to do harm to the resist movements by dividing us into competing sections. My purpose for this talk is to get tough with a group of people who I find to be my natural allies. And having an honest conversation, asking the question, how? How did we get here? Can we be truthful about the bitter realities of the Democratic Party? And to ask the resist movement to be very weary about the outcome of a Trump impeachment. Because, lest I remind you, Mike Pence ain't no bundle of joy, and it is not necessarily something we should all look forward to in the event of an impeachment. It might be helpful for me to give you a brief history regarding how I came to have these beliefs. I hope it's not too redundant or too much in depth, because it's not what I want to focus on, but to understand my story might help you see where I came to some of these results that we'll talk about. I grew up in a yellow dog Democrat house, son to an artist mother and a Methodist pastor father. With two siblings, it's safe to say we were all raised with very liberal views, although I had no idea what that word meant until much, much later in my life. Politics meant very little to me. I only knew it was important that we treat people with respect. We do the best we can. We work hard. We help others when we can. And we try to do the right thing even when it's difficult. But when the United States went to war with Iraq, I must be honest in saying that I found it little more than unfortunate. Admittedly, I was even a little excited to be an American when the infamous shock and awe campaign was carried out over Baghdad. I felt slightly patriotic, and I say that with great shame this much later on in my life. I was 18 years old, truculent and combative, and had a blind mistrust of authority figures, no matter who they be, not realizing that I had given over so much of myself to an institution that could do that to another country. Despite that fact, honestly, I wanted to be a pastor, and I suppose in my heart I still do, but I guess I never quite got over that authority thing, and the church isn't real keen on that sometimes. Over the course of the next 5 years and several life-changing experiences, my worldview came a little bit more into focus. In 2006, I purchased a home 2 weeks before I turned 21, and I moved in with some great friends. And it was so easy to get that loan, handing them out like candy. I could have gotten a loan selling candy bars to the lender. Local small company, it was so tiny that coincidentally, the woman who signed the paperwork, my father had married her and her husband a couple years before that. That's how local we're talking about. I was in a serious relationship at the time and was so excited to be realizing my American dream that I even got a dog that first month, just to try to, round out the picture. Just missing the white picket fence is really all I was loose there. But I had a really great job working at a bank, getting great benefits, paid vacation, welcome. I even had a matched 401k, and for my early 20s, this was simply brilliant. Nothing better than that. But within that first year of having the home, the housing bubble popped. And my home lost tens of thousands of dollars in equity overnight. I was going to be living in that house for a very long time if I ever wanted to see my way out. I did eventually get out. But as the years trickled on, friends moved on. I got a second job to help pay the bills and became a youth pastor at a church. It was a wonderful job, and although I was working 60-hour weeks, I was one of the happiest times of my life. Then the bank I worked for started struggling. They tried a few fairly radical promotions to bring in new capital. Then there was a loan collapse, and then another. The bank was really in trouble, and investors were called in to try and save it. Something spooked them, and they split as fast as they came. A local developer who was very close with the bank at that time, and what I call the good old boys club, told the Colorado paper a few years later in 2014, quote, if it would have been Vegas, everyone would have crowded around me at the craps table. Everything we touched was easy and worked. The paper said he had the Midas touch. Some customers were getting loans to cover loans to cover loans. Rumors spread that some were getting loans to purchase bank stock, which is outrageously illegal. The writing was on the wall, and one incredibly surreal Friday afternoon, all the employees were requested to come sit in the lobby of the bank and listen to a prepared statement. We were told the bank was insolvent and now owned by the state of Colorado, and we were all employees of the state. Regulators from the FDIC came flooding in through the front door in what I can only describe looked like a row of cockroaches. No offense to these wonderful, hardworking men and women, but it was so bizarre, and they flooded into the bank, into every office, file cabinet, and computer. I've never seen anything like that in my life, and I ever doubt that I will again. It was the 23rd bank in the United States to fail in 2009. Some lost everything. Most of my retirement was worthless, and the rest was liquidated. My thought was, it's okay, I have another job. I'll just collect unemployment here and look for something else. I was told, though, because of my other employment, that this wouldn't happen. I would receive nothing. So I went to my mortgage company, which in this time had been swallowed up by Citibank and was now the handler of my mortgage, and asked if I could fill out a hardship package, which is something you fill out when you get laid off from a bank. And they are supposed to help you restructure your loans so that you can find out affordable ways to repay them. It's supposed to be a program that's good for the lender and for the consumer. They told me that because I was unemployed, I was a high-risk liability, and they would no longer be able to assist me. Good luck. So, I did the only sensible thing that a 20-something should. I quit my job, I sold most of my assets, I put the rest in storage, I rented out my home, I collected that unemployment, and I did it unabashedly, and I'd do it again. I bought a van, I traveled everywhere I could for a year, and this time encouraged me to go back to university and bring on more student debt, because why not? I'm getting pretty good at it. I was a student at UMass Boston, and had not only my first real exposure to socialist principles, but also the opportunity to participate with Occupy Boston at Dewey Square, which I did so with great naivety and bewilderment and curiosity. The 99%, wow. After that, and including the years leading up to my arrival in Germany 4 years ago, I learned all about what it means for a bank to be too big to fail. Becoming even bigger than before, accepting millions in government bailouts, by paying taxpayer bonuses to executives while laying off low-level employees, lying to consumers and taxpayers. Even as the biggest offenders were receiving government money, executives like Chase CEO Jamie Dimon were purchasing their own bank stock. No criminal prosecutions, coupled with implicit guarantees that the government will always be there for you. Well, they weren't there for us. The problem was not Barack Obama's to own, but the resolution or lack thereof was. It has become quite clear to me over the last 10 years that there's a separate set of rules for the richest and most powerful elite and another set for the rest of us. My experiences have taught me 99% versus 1% is a very real phenomenon. And I'm a middle-class, straight, white male from a good home. This is my story. I cannot even imagine what that looks like for other people. This is the definition of white privilege, and I feel like I got screwed over. I need to put that into perspective sometimes, but it's hard to imagine. While I was at Occupy Boston, I did have the chance to see political dissident Noam Chomsky speak with my friend here. We couldn't hear a word he said, for that matter. But I'd actually only heard of his name for the first time about 48 hours before we went. I had no idea who this guy was. Most of you are probably familiar with the professor of linguistics from MIT. Chomsky has written over 100 books on these topics, and you may probably already know that the most recent of which is now a documentary form entitled Requiem for an American Dream, which reminds me of another great George Carlin quote. They call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. In the documentary, Chomsky discusses our extreme inequality and the consolidation of wealth and power in the United States. He begins with an anecdote from history regarding democracy itself, and it goes something like this. Democracy is an invention of the Greek, and even since its inception, have rulers been acutely aware of the risk of providing the demos, meaning the people, the kratos, meaning the power, literally the power of the people. That is democracy. In Plato's Republic, it states, it is nothing short of a guarantee that if the poorest segments of society are given enough power, surely they will unite to take away the wealth from the opulent, that is to say, the richest of the rich, today's 0.1% in the United States. Crazy, filthy rich. This theme was no less prevalent nearly 2,000 years later when our forefathers were drafting the Constitution, and James Madison expressed his concern not much differently. Poor people will not maintain the status quo of the elite if given the authority to make change. Same problem of democracy. However, the most interesting part is the conclusions that they came to. Plato says in order to reduce the risk of democratic society taking the wealth of the rich, there remains the need to reduce inequality. Provide social programs and sufficient wages so that the poorest can provide themselves with food, clothing, and shelter at a minimum effort. Madison's conclusion was to reduce democracy. That is, make participation harder, and that is the foundation for which our country was founded. It therefore shouldn't be very difficult to see why voting rights have been a struggle up to this very day. We have 4 amendments to our Constitution, a very short Constitution, specifically about voting. First, white property-owning males. Then all white males. Then black men. And then women. Nearly 97 years later, I understand there is a bitter feeling of having lost this chance for the first female president of the United States. And I do understand that frustration. Of course, I'll never fully understand it. I don't want to mansplain anybody. So let's put aside for a moment the years-long witch hunt that has been waged on Hillary Clinton. Most of the things that have been spoken about her, to her, of her, have almost zero foundation in any sort of democratic arena. Her main opposition has narrowly focused on a tiny number of over-exaggerated scandals in which the focus has been shifted away from that which truly mattered, which is the absurdity of the status quo. A system that has not served the greater public in nearly 50 years. Nearly every issue that Republicans have picked with her pale in comparison to the true crime of our government, the normalization of corruption through the ability of the richest of the rich to literally purchase every branch of government. The United States brand of democracy has been in regression long before the words president and Trump were ever breathed in the same breath. We need to begin a concerted effort to democratize our democracy in a way that we've never done before. While many cannot see how a real estate tycoon with no political experience, literally none, and an endless list of scandals could rise to the top of a political ladder with literally minimal effort, it would be a colossal mistake for us to simply forego an analysis of the 63 million people who voted for him. 63 million people is a whole lot of people to write off as simply racist, stupid, or some combination of the two. Arlie Hochschild, sociologist and author, a wonderful author, called these people strangers in their own homeland in a book that she wrote by the same title. She claims that Trump voters she interviewed chose him out of desperation, as many of the people in their communities have had their American dreams, their right to the American dream, stalled for decades. Many of these voters have been largely abandoned by the Democratic Party, as evidenced by the slim margins of victory in the Rust Belt. I'm well aware that voter suppression methods, popularly, though not exclusively, used by Republicans, disenfranchised huge swaths of voters in these areas, likely giving the election to Trump. Dirty tricks like cross-check and Chris Kobach, which have been popularly utilized by the GOP in the most egregious of ways. But I'm not speaking to the GOP right now. I doubt very much that they would be so open-minded as to have me come and speak to them as you all have now. But believe me, if I get invited, you'll all be the first to know, okay? As has been stated, there were only two alternatives to the establishment this election: Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. One a billionaire with a penchant for late-night Twitter rants against celebrities, and the other, the longest-serving independent in congressional history. It feels like a no-brainer now, right? They were the only two who consistently ran on platforms of outing a corrupt system, although ironically it remains to be seen how a Sanders presidency would have shaped that policy. We don't have to wait very long to see how Trump does or doesn't. As we see time and time again, this opulent class, again, this richest of the rich, while tending to be more in line with Republican values, is reliably impartial as long as investments in candidates called contributions, there's a lot of air quotes tonight, I'm really fired up about this, result in policy outcomes that in turn deregulate their respective industries, the environments, our privacy, our workplaces, even the family home, from the clothes we wear, the television we watch, all the way down to the food on the table at dinner time. It is common practice for massive corporations to hedge their bets on both sides of an election, not for ideological purposes, which is itself a mutation of democracy, but for the purpose of securing the bottom line of profit statements. And boy, oh boy, is it profitable. Fossil fuels being the archetype example, although we could speak for days about a number of industries that participate in this. But let's just focus on one, let's just say ExxonMobil. Represent.us is an organization that is a non-partisan organization that has drafted something called the Anti-Corruption Act from former lobbyists and a huge list of both former Democrats, Republicans, active Republicans, all aimed with the emphasis of getting money out of politics. The first statewide version of this was passed in South Dakota in November and was passed by voters and repealed by the Senate in South Dakota, a Republican Senate, using state of emergency powers. It is a disgusting use of democracy or violation of. Nonetheless, Represent.us follows a lot of these numbers and reports that since 2010, ExxonMobil has lobbied the United States government to the tune of $88 million. $88 million since 2010. To both major parties, for that matter. Current Secretary of State and former Exxon executive Rex Tillerson has personally written checks to members of Congress. In 2014, just over $30 million was funneled to all congressional candidates from the entire oil and gas industry. That's from the entire oil and gas industry. The U.S. then handed over $21 billion in subsidies only for production of fossil fuels. This is about little over half of the entire amount of those subsidies. Some may say that this is just a necessary evil that allows for the price of oil to remain affordable for consumers. It's a service to us. To which I would reply by informing you that ExxonMobil, just ExxonMobil, reported $9.6 billion, billion with a B, in U.S. profits only for that year. $88 million since 2010 for the train of probably 5, maybe 6 years, with a return on investment, $9.6 billion. These numbers are astounding. I'll let you do the math. A second argument may be that Republicans are more likely to accept this money. We know that, right? The Republican Party loves clean coal and fracking and anything that comes out of the ground and smells like dirt, right? That being said, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was a top recipient of these contributions, behind only Ted Cruz and our current president. Further, why are Democrats choosing to play a game just enough to get their hands dirty, but not enough to actually win? This is some kind of sick masochism, where under President Obama's 2 terms, 1,030 congressional seats, state legislatures, and governorships were lost. This is an astounding record of failure for the Democratic Party. A clean break with this type of fundraising is so badly needed, not just in the Democratic Party, not just in the United States, but worldwide. But how is that possible to do when the addiction to that money runs so deep? The simple and hard truth is the United States democracy is a house of cards with red and blue mortar, with maybe just a little bit of yellow and green trim at the attic window. It would be a tragedy to steer this reality toward obscurity by flirting with outskirts of conspiracy, so let's do our best to deal with facts, admittedly something our president is not familiar with. Again, Noam Chomsky calls Donald Trump a caricature of neoliberalism, because he clearly demonstrates in near satirical form what economic pursuit to no end creates. Donald Trump is so clearly a bad guy. And that says so much about how broken things are, because what makes the entire situation both tragedy and comedy, the Greeks would be so proud of us. That was a joke, but that was a good one. You're going to set that in later, okay? It'd be funny if the consequences weren't so dire. Democrats have a real opportunity to be a clear good guy, but they won't be. As long as Democrats like Senator Dianne Feinstein continue to say there will be no single-payer health care, or Nancy Pelosi continues to ask when questioned why the Democratic Party is so engaged in capitalist behavior, that that's just the way it is, or when people like John Kerry, our former Secretary of State, who was one of the leading people invested in defense contractors. As long as the revolving door to massive lobbying firms stays open, or as long as Democratic presidents fill their staff with Goldman Sachs bankers, there's no future. And how is the Democratic Party doing today? Currently, there is a judicial case being heard between former Bernie Sanders supporters versus the Democratic National Committee and former Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz for their handling of the primary. The Sanders supporters argue that the DNC failed to remain neutral in the pursuit of their own charter regarding a democratic process to select their candidate. From Newsweek, quote, Jared Beck, a Harvard Law graduate and one of the several attorneys, argues that the DNC violated Article 5, Section 4 of its own charter by working with a single campaign to effectively choose who would win the Democratic ballot, end quote. And the response of the DNC is the most atrocious part of this entire story. Their primary legal defense, not a secondary, not a third idea, not something they thought about the next day and wish they would have said, their primary defense, stated best by attorney Bruce Spiva, quote, we could have voluntarily decided that, look, we're going to go into back rooms like they used to, smoke cigars, and pick the candidate that way. In other words, democracy is a cute game meant to make us feel cozy inside, but it is never meant to be actually democratic. Because the DNC is a private organization, my guess is that the argument will likely win them this case, and that is extremely unfortunate. I have no words for that. Let us imagine for a moment that Trump didn't get elected on the promise of building a wall. Let's just entertain an alternative universe where there's no Muslim ban, no inappropriate Twitter messages or audio leaks. What if he was pro-gun control, pro-choice, and pro-LGBTQ? What if he was elected Democrat? Would his behavior bother us? Is it okay then? It's my observation that the love of the home team causes us to be blind with serious deficiencies in the behavior. Because here's the bottom line, and if there's one thing that you all take from it tonight, I really hope it's this. Donald Trump is a symptom of the illness. He is not the illness. The Russian leaks may be all well and true, and hopefully investigation sees that through. We have a process, let's do it. It's so easy to ride that wave of anger when we already dislike this guy so much. But I believe we should really find truly criminal are the things he does right out in the open. His rabid abuse of the emoluments clause of the Constitution with his business ties around the world and investments in companies like Raytheon, the company whose value shot up $1 billion overnight when 59 Tomahawk missiles were launched into Syria in April. What about $500 billion in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia over the next 10 years? While it continues to fund terrorists, imprison journalists, and political activists, and actively send 17 million innocent civilians into starvation in Yemen. Then there's the pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Couldn't be any better time for this topic. Scientists believing that there is an anthropogenic global warming, most likely due to the kind of cozy relationships that Donald Trump and others have with an industry that has long outlived its contribution to society. These are the real issues. These are the problems that should make front pages and the news. And this is what should make Trump impeachable. There's just one problem, is we don't have a paddy wagon big enough to fit all of the representatives in our democracy. He's not the only one. A huge number of our millionaire representatives from both major parties are financed by and invested in the military-industrial complex. They are reluctant to curb military spending because they are jobs programs. And many receive legalized kickbacks called dividends. When we go to war based on decisions made by our representatives, or we just bomb people for the hell of it, our representatives get checks. The funding of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen was kickstarted by Democrats, and domestic oil and gas drilling skyrocketed under Obama. And big grassroots stops like the Keystone XL and Standing Rock, what we did to those people in the middle of the winter is inexcusable. That was on Barack Obama's dime, and the stopping of those pipelines was not because of his empathy for the environment. It was because of hard-working grassroots activists like us, like people who get out there and do something about it. The same with immigration, as he became dubbed the deporter-in-chief, or his support for private corporations and governments to secretly negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then the attempt to fast-track it through Congress. A treaty that was basically written, copied, and pasted legislation. Proposals written by corporate lawyers. Or the years-long support by the party of anti-democratic, pro-hedge fund decisions like Citizens United, allowing virtually unlimited amounts of cash to speak for the will of a very few. And the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act that kept what little money we do have safe from risky investing. These values are not the values of a free and open society. They are not democratic values. They are the values of a thriving duopoly. In other words, what Lawrence Ferlinghetti calls a bird with two right wings. A recent and famous, or rather infamous perhaps, Princeton study looked at the influence of American support for policy versus the likelihood of passing laws through Congress. They found out what public policy was, what public intent was, what did they want, and what exactly panned out in Congress. Their study mentioned, quote, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy, end quote. The worst part of that study, again, comes at the end. The punchline, of course, is on us. That study only looks at the bottom 90% of income earners. When they examined the top 10%, the richest 10% of Americans, the foundings of what American individuals, businesses, and special interests, those who can afford lobbyists, many of whom are former representatives, senators, governors, had significantly better representation in the passage of laws. That is an abuse of democracy. That is not democratic. The tragic truth in America is that the goalposts of what is considered rational behavior has been pushed so far back that we're not even on the same field anymore. And as long as Democrats will defend their party to the bitter end, and Republicans will do likewise, duopolistic, plutocratic elites with the money to move mountains, sometimes literally, will continue to pit us against one another over hot-button issues. Watching the perverse act of the poorest defending the greed of the rich until the conclusion of the bitter end. It has become easier with the internet to connect us, securely verify our identities, and stay up to date with the flow of news. And while there remains a real problem of the flow of fake news, accurate information does remain accessible for those who seek it. Because of this, there remains no more valid excuses for why we are not actively transforming our society to be more democratic, not less. It's easy to think of democracy as merely political. But we should never forget the morality of an equal distribution of power. All hierarchies, top to bottom, legitimate or illegitimate, are systems of unequal power distribution. Perhaps the time has come to take the model of absolute democracy and apply it to all the arenas of our lives, both in owning the process and the product and controlling the decision-making process. From our workplaces to city planning, perhaps our sports teams and other radical examples. Why isn't Facebook owned by the people who use it? Why does a handful of people get to decide what's put in front of our faces every day? And no less in our families and in our communities where we raise our children. If our children will inherit this planet, this also is something I think about often. What reason is there left for us to deny them decision-making rights? Until the age of 18, when we're comfortable letting them die for wars that we decided on the same day that they become eligible to have a say in it. That is priority schizophrenia. We need an election holiday week where we celebrate like it's the 4th of July because we're proud, independent patriots. Are we not? Another thing I think Democrats should do, this is on a side note, but and nationalism is always a risk. But there is absolutely no reason that Republicans deserve this concept of being the patriotic party while Democrats somehow are constantly bitching about it. This is nonsense, and it should be put to rest. Some critics might say of what I'm saying, okay, you want to democratize sports teams, you want to democratize the workplace, democratize everything. They may say and point to historical failures of communism as a retort, but unfortunately most of the examples of communism that we've seen failures in are not communist or socialist, but are rather simply state capitalists. It still has zero democratic principles when you look inside the box. I'm not trying to convince anybody to leave or stay in the Democratic Party. I'm merely asking you as Democratic voters to confront the ugly truth about our precarious democracy and legalized corruption. And in the way the Democratic Party, your party, is complicit in reproducing these structures. It belongs to you, but they are constantly reproducing structures of inequality. Because if something's not done today, symptoms like Donald Trump will only be exacerbated, and the power of the government will continue to be consolidated into the hands of a very few group of individuals. My challenge to Democrats abroad Stuttgart and to citizens everywhere is to think creatively about how your democratic power, your critical mass, your weight as a group can be utilized to leverage lawmakers into working for voters instead of for dollars or for more power. and to imagine ways in which it becomes possible to diminish or even eliminate, when possible, the power of elected representatives as we increase the power of the majority. Even the noblest God King does us absolutely no good if his firstborn son is an asshole. Duopoly comes before monopoly, and diminishing diversity puts the entire system at risk of collapse. One last thought. Look at our agricultural system. For a moment, try not to think of it as merely an asset to the economy. Think of it in terms of lifeblood of the civilization, a living, breathing organism, rich with nutritious potential and future dinner conversations. It has unfortunately become increasingly isolated to cash crops that reap limited benefits, over-subsidized and dripping with chemical solutions to Mother Nature's own biological processes. It's a lack of diversification that leads to desertification. But there's hope. A growing body of local, small, grassroots farmers are cooperating democratically and fighting the hegemonic status quo of business as usual farming. As these farms diversify their harvest, they are saving the soil from which they came. It's true in farming, it's true in economics, and it's true in politics. Thank you very much for having me.